You probably recognize this. This is a SRAM Eagle XO 12-speed 10 through 52 tooth mountain bike rear cassette. It's pretty darn light. It's also fairly expensive. Other than that, it works just fine, except, well, I've been putting it on a gravel bike, and that has been just slightly less than fine. And in this video, I'm going to talk about why that is. This is the second in the series of talking about gearing, how I've been looking at refining my gearing, not just for my gravel bike, mostly that, but also for my all-road bike, my Time 80HX. That is a video coming up because I made some changes to that. But today we're talking about a recent change I made to do something different than this on the back of my Turner Cyclosis gravel bike. Now, you know me. Well, if you don't, you're going to know me if you stick around this channel long enough. You know that my reviews and my videos are more experiential based. In other words, what you're not going to see from me is highly detailed flow charts and graphs and numbers. I'm going to go use something. I'm going to tell you how it worked for me, why it worked, why it didn't work, and why I think that is based on my 40 years of doing this kind of stuff, right? But today, by golly, I'm going to break tradition. I'm going to reach for the stars. I will actually show you a graph, a chart, and some numbers. Hold on. This can get kind of crazy. But in the meantime, there is a problem with this cassette. Well, what is it? It's not because it doesn't shift well. It does. And it's not because it doesn't give me low enough gearing or tall enough gearing, because it does. Running a 40-tooth front chainring on the front of my Turner Cyclosis, it's really all the gearing that I need at either end of for all my gravel use and road use that I use the bike for. But there is an issue, and it bugs the heck out of me on the gravel bike, but on a mountain bike, it really doesn't bother me at all. And the problem is right here. But before I get into that, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk briefly about the history of a cassette like this and why this is an issue. Because you know what this is? This is called a gap. This is a gap. This is a fairly big gap, actually. So when you look at the tooth count in this cassette, it runs from 10 to a 52. Now, that's all fine. I think it's like 520% range of gearing. That's a lot. However, look at the difference between this cog and this cog. This second cog down has a 42-tooth cassette. That's a 10-tooth jump, and that is what you would call a gap. Yep, and that is a big gap. Remember a while ago there was a clothing company, maybe they're still around, The Gap, and they had that slogan, fall into the gap. Well, with this cassette on the gravel bike, kind of fallen into the gap. It's been bugging me. When SRAM created 1x, okay, that was quite a few years ago, it was 1x11. Now, I had never seen a cassette this big. It was a 1042, and everybody's like, wow, that is a really big cassette. And running it on a mountain bike, you typically had like a 30-tooth front chainring. So you had a 30-10 for a tall gear and a 30-42. That's a 12-tooth jump between the two, 12-tooth difference, right? It was an okay low gear. It wasn't great, honestly, for a mountain bike. And a 30-10, it was fairly easy to spin out, but you know, it got you from trailhead to trailhead okay. But it wasn't great. In fact, I found 1x11 for where I live really kind of lacking, especially if you're like bike packing. A 30-42 really isn't low enough. So SRAM, when they went 12-speed, which you know that's inevitable, we just keep adding gears in the cassettes, the next cassette went from a 1042 to a 1050. That was pretty cool. So now you had that 8-tooth jump between this cog and this cog in the cassette. That actually was pretty good. Now here's something, you may know this, but we'll geek out just a minute here, and hopefully I'll do a good job explaining this, because you know, I'm no scientist. When you're looking at the gear jumps in a cassette, you need to look at it in percentages, because if you just go by the number of teeth difference between the two, you're going to wonder, well, how come we go from say a 13 to a 14 or a 14 to a 15 or a 15 to a 16, you know. And then as we start going up the cassette, you start seeing it, you know, go from a 20 to a 23 or a 23 to a 27, and the gap, you know, get bigger, 32 to a 36, etc. Because it's expressed in percentages. So think about it this way. The difference between a 10 and 11, okay, a 10-tooth cog to 11-tooth cog is 10%, right? 10% of a 10-tooth cog is one tooth, and one tooth added to a 10-tooth cog gets you an 11. So you have a 10% jump shifting from the 10 to the 11, and that doesn't feel too abrupt. But on this cassette, for instance, it goes from a 10 to a 12. Now that's a 20% jump. And you can notice that when you're shifting around to 10 to a 12, 10 to a 12 is a pretty big jump, and you'll feel it in your pedaling cadence. You'll be rolling along in the 10, you go to the 12, you're spinning pretty good. 10 to 11 feels much more natural. But when you start working your way up the cassette, let's say you've got a 40-tooth cog, 40 teeth on any cog in your cassette, and you want to go one more, you want to add one. Well, 10% of a 40-tooth cog is 4 teeth. So that the next cog up to keep that even, Steven, would be a 44-tooth cog. Now, as the jumps go up the cassette, they tend to get even bigger than that, and 10% is not held throughout a whole cassette. All right, it would be more like 12, 13. I think Shimano likes to do 13% jumps, something like that. The problem is, you want to go from here teeny tiny to here really, really big, and you've only got 12 gears to do it in. And so at some point, you can't keep it as smooth a percentage difference as you'd like. And if you're going to make a big jump, typically it starts to happen in the top third of the cassette. Now on a mountain bike, that's really not that big a deal because you want big jumps in your cassette on a mountain bike, especially in the top, because very typically you're going to come around the corner and the trail's just going to go bam. And if you have to shift like 2 gears to get really low when you need it like now, a mountain bike, you want, in my opinion, those bigger jumps in the gears because you're not so concerned about your spinning cadence as you are getting the amount of torque and the amount of low gear right now to get you up over something. Anyway, for a mountain bike, it's good, but I'm riding a gravel bike. All right, back to the SRAM 12-speed cassette now, after we talked about percentages. We talked that it went from a 1042 to a 1050, which was pretty good. And I have a 1050 cassette in the garage from the old days. But you know what? With the race to get more range on the cassettes, then I think what Shimano came out with a 1051 when they went 12-speed, and SRAM answered, says, well, we'll see that 51 and raise you a tooth, and they gave us a 1052. But what they didn't do is they didn't change the second cog down. So now we've got a 52 to a 42. Well, that's a 10-tooth jump in the cassette. Now on a mountain bike, that's not really that big a deal. You use your lowest gear just to poodle up the trail on the steep parts, and then you shift out of it. But you know, like on a road bike, though, you really want, if you can, you want those cadence jumps to be as close as you can, because sometimes you can live and die in a situation where your cadence doesn't change too much. If you're caught in the purgatory of too low a gear or too high a gear, that can be miserable on a road bike. And on a gravel bike, it's somewhat sort of in the middle somewhere. So what I found was, basically, to sum it up, the jump from the 42 to the 52 is a big pedaling cadence jump. And I will find on some of my rides, a lot of my rides, that a 40-42, 40-tooth chainring, 42-tooth second cog is really not that low a gear. And so as the grade increases, I'm loading up my legs and I think, okay, I need to shift. Then I'll shift to the 52, and a 40-52 is a 12-tooth difference. I went from a 2-tooth difference to a 12-tooth difference, and now I'll just be spinning much faster than I need to. I'm cross-chaining more than I want to, and I'm wearing out the top aluminum cog of this very expensive cassette. And no, so I'd shift down out of it, and then I'm lugging the engine, so to speak, again. There had to be a better solution, and I found out there really is. Anyway, first let's figure out what SRAM did with the T-type transmission and why they changed that. And also then we'll get into my final solution. All right, here we go. Okay, T-type transmission, you see it here on the screen, which was basically, you know, it was a evolution of the UDH. When SRAM did the UDH derailleur, which I actually have that on my Turner Cyclosis, I think they were setting the stage knowing that transmission was coming. And what transmission is, you know, it kind of looks like this cassette, a little bit different, but it's actually kind of programmed in a sense that most of the cogs, I think one cog is not, but all the rest of them are narrow, wide teeth, like the chain rings. And so the advantage of T-type transmission is it allows you to shift under like full load. I don't even think you need to lift off the pedals, so to speak, to shift it. I've never ridden it, but that's what I hear. So for a mountain bike, that's pretty cool. For a gravel bike, I don't really know if we care about that so much. But what they did do is they respaced the top of the cassette. What they did was create a lot less of a gap. And I thought, ooh, I am in for SRAM transmission. That, honestly, I don't really care about shifting under pressure on the gravel bike, but to get rid of that gap, I would probably invest in T-type transmission. However, what I found out was, besides the cost of the stuff, is it upshifts slowly and downshifts slowly, and on the gravel bike, I don't really think I want that. It requires its own ecosystem, etc., its own chain, and it's, like typical. And I thought, well, I don't really know if I like that. I really just want that cassette spacing. And also, they realigned the chain line is a little bit better, actually, because the cassettes shifted over a little bit in the frame. Both of those things were a plus for me, but all the minuses really didn't weigh out. And I thought, I guess I'll just have to live with this 42-52 jump the gap I keep falling into. And then I found out something that just changed everything. I found Garbaruk. Now Garbaruk, they're not new. I think they started out making like longer cages for your derailleurs and things, so you could run a deeper cassette on like a GRX and stuff like that. Pretty cool, pretty handy. And then they making pulleys and different things. Well now, and maybe for a while, they're making entire cassettes. And they are, my friends, a thing of beauty. This is not for my Turner Cyclosis. I just got a black one for that. No, this is for a future Mrs. Granny Gear build I'll be talking about later. It's a nice titanium frame I got tucked away in the garage, and this little purple beauty is going to go on it. This is a Garbaruk 1052 Eagle compatible cassette. Now, I don't know if you can see it on the screen. It's all machined very much like the SRAM is, the Eagle cassette, where it's all billet steel, one-piece machining on it. It's absolutely gorgeous. And the top cog, the 52 on this, is aluminum, and it's anodized. Isn't that pretty? I think this thing's absolutely gorgeous to look at. Now, before I get into more details on it, why bother? Why would I do this over this, and what problem did it solve? What Garbaruk did is they pretty much copied the SRAM T-type transmission gear spacing in the top 3 gears. So now, instead of this being a 42 to a 52, it's a 44 to a 52. Now you might think to yourself, 2 teeth, does that really make a difference? Well, in your head you think 2 teeth isn't much, but in percentages, 2 teeth is a lot. And so now this is much more like where we went from a 42 to a 50 with the older SRAM 12-speed cassette, which that gap is really not that big a deal. That feels pretty nice, in pedaling cadence and transition. But this gets me to the 52 tooth, which I kind of like, and the 44 takes that big gap and balances that out much better. But what about the other parts of this? Because it's not just about the teeth, right? You just got to shift good. It can't weigh a whole lot, etc., etc. What does it cost? So let's take a look at that real quick, and then we'll talk about how it is to ride and did it solve my problem? And by golly, we're actually going to look at a chart and some numbers because we got some data to look at. Putting it up on the scale, we can see that it only weighs a couple soda crackers worth of grams heavier than the SRAM cassette. It's basically the same. Like I said, the quality of it, it's beautiful. It mounts the same as you would expect, it mounts on an XDR, XD free hub body just fine. So look at these 2 cassettes side by side. You can see, even by your eye, how the 2 top gears, it's quite a difference actually, even when you look at them and compare them. But more than that, we need to go ride it and see, because it can't just be pretty and it can't just be light. It actually has to shift really well, doesn't it? And that takes us to a little bit of section on trail. Now, here's what I did. I've got a ride that I do quite a bit. And it's a 33 to 35-ish mile loop, depending upon how I do it. It's got a lot of climbing in it. It's 2,500 feet in just, I think, around 7 or 7.5 miles of that. So that's it's quite a bit of climbing, and the climbing is dirt. It's typically kind of rough. It can be loose in places, a bit rocky and rutted, and so it hurts you a little bit, that climb. And the grades get up to well over 10% in places. I'd say 15%, and sometimes it'll stay 12, 13, 14% for extended periods of time. So it's a pretty good climb. It's the kind of climb where sometimes I'd get stuck between the 40-52 combination, and I really wouldn't quite need it, and then I'd go to the 40-42 combination, and I'd think, that just isn't enough. It was making me a little bit crazy. So I thought, if I'm going to test this cassette, I want to see if I can eliminate that purgatory gap, if you will. I want to see if I can, will the Garbaruk allow me to stay out of that 52-tooth cog on my cassette long enough to make it worth the effort? Will I get out of that extreme chain line of the 52 that I'd rather not run in for long periods of time? Will it help me in that case also to stop wearing out this quite expensive cassette, because I'm in this aluminum top cog more than I really want to, but I need to because the one below it isn't getting it done? Will the Garbaruk fix that? So how does it shift? I can't tell the difference between this and the SRAM cassette, and if anything, it might shift slightly smoother, but I wouldn't want to live on the difference. Basically, occasionally you get a really noisy shift with this. You know, SRAM does the same thing. But as far as going up the cassette, down the cassette, blindfolded, I could not tell you the difference between this and the SRAM cassette. One thing I did notice was, as far as just using it, I swear this is a quieter running cassette than the SRAM cassette. Just hearing it interact with the chain. I'm not really sure why. I don't think that's my imagination, but that was my distinct impression. And so far, even after, I don't know, a couple hundred miles of riding on it, that seems to be lasting. It does seem like it runs quieter. All right. So here we are in my ride loop. And like I said, I picked this loop because it's one that I know it has some, not extreme climbing, but some climbing that challenges me in those upper gears. So I'm in them a lot. But the rest of the ride has got a fast downhill canyon road to it. And then it ends up being maybe a 2-3% downhill to a equivalent bike path back. I probably got 20, I don't know, what would I have, 15 miles maybe of downhill canyon roads leading to bike path back to coffee, right? So it gives me the whole gamut really of using the cassette. I'll be using the upper half of the cassette in the dirt, and I'll be using the bottom half of the cassette for the rest of the ride. So it's kind of my litmus test. What I wanted to see was, if I change to the Garbaruk cassette, what is that going to do to my gear usage for this ride? This ride will be my beta test for this. Now, which brings me to my gear chart and my numbers and my data, because this is very exciting. I've never done this on a video before. Here's the deal. I'm using SRAM Access, which is, of course, you know, electronic shifting. It's pretty smart stuff. And it knows, that derailleur knows what gear it's in at any given time. And if you want it to, it can tell you how many times you were in that gear over a ride and how long you were in it, how many shifts you made. And so all you need is a computer that is really basically paired up to your rear derailleur, and like my Wahoo will do, it'll tell me, if I want to on my screen, what gear I'm in, how my battery status is, etc. But it gets better than that. It will also, if you upload your ride file, there's a SRAM Access, I'll put a link, it's the Access online web portal. You can upload your file from your computer or from Ride with GPS, and it will give you the data of your ride and your gear usage. And it gives you all kinds of other stuff, but I cared about gear usage. So what it allowed me to do basically was look at how often and how long and how many shifts I made across my cassette, what gear I was in, like how long I was in each gear, how much I used each gear. So will the Garbaruk cassette get me out of the 52-tooth gear in places where I really didn't need it, but the 42 wasn't quite low enough? Will it get me out of that long enough to notice? And what about the rest of the cassette, right? How long was I in the 10? Am I not using the 10? If I'm not using the 10-tooth at all, well, maybe I could go to a smaller front ring and use my cassette even better. So having those numbers at hand really sounded like a handy thing to have. And you know what? It was. Because otherwise, I would have just kind of been looking back and guessing. All right, here we go. Let's open up the laptop and let's look at a screenshot I have comparing the two usages, and we'll get this wrapped up. All right, now I'll put this up on the screen so you can see what I'm looking at. Basically, this is kind of a little screen capture of the two cassettes laid side by side in the gear usage. You can see that at the top where it says gear usage. On the left, as you're looking at the screen, that is the SRAM Eagle cassette, the 1052. And if you look at the left column on it, you can see where it goes from a 10 tooth up to a 52 tooth. And then right above that, it'll say the front ring is a 40-tooth SRAM. That is the SRAM Eagle cassette. On the right, you can see the Garbaruk cassette. And you'll see it starts as a 10 at the bottom, and it goes up to a 52, and at the top is the 40-tooth SRAM front ring. So that's the same, except you notice in the numbers, when you start going 52, 42, 36, 32 with the SRAM, well, the Garbaruk goes 52, 44, 37, 32. So the top three gears are different, and the gaps are less in between each gear. So let's look at the usage. On the left, when we look at the SRAM, I spent 40 minutes on my initial ride with the SRAM cassette, on that same ride in the 52-tooth cassette. And that climb takes me about an hour and a half to do the dirt section of the climb. So 40 minutes of that time with the SRAM cassette, I was in my 52. That's a long time. I was only in the 42 for 22 minutes. All right, so let's, for the moment, just look at those two gears. Those are the two I really care about. Now let's look at the Garbaruk. Same ride, basically same conditions. You know, was I feeling the same each day? I don't know. I felt okay both days, so shouldn't be much of a difference there. Now take a look at that. On the Garbaruk, in the 52 tooth, I spent 30 minutes, almost 31 minutes in the gear. That is 10 minutes less of 52 tooth cog usage compared to the SRAM cassette. And where did that 10 minutes go to? Well, it went to the 44. Because you look at the 44 tooth use on the Garbaruk, now that's up to 35 minutes, almost 36, where at the SRAM cassette, I'm down to 22, almost 23. All right, so we'll sum that up in a second, but let's also look down the cassette, because this whole program, I think, is really quite handy if you want to see how you're using your cassette on your typical ride. Notice on the left, on the SRAM, I'm in my 10 tooth for only 2 minutes and 39 seconds. Now, there are times on that descent, I'm going 25 plus miles an hour, but I'm not really pedaling, I'm coasting. It's just a pretty winding canyon road. I'm not pedaling a whole lot. I could have been pedaling in the 10, but I just didn't need to. For some reason, with the Garbaruk, I was in the 10 and the 12, the 10 more, and hardly in the 12 at all, but in the 14 is about the same, 16, 18, it's about the same. Notice I'm almost hardly ever in the middle of the cassette, which is kind of interesting. So we'll get to that in the next video on how I'm going to use the cassette wiser and what the next step is. But anyway, all right. So let's kind of sum up how this has worked, and we'll close up. But aren't you proud of me? Aren't you proud of me? My golly, I actually got a chart out and gave you some numbers. Ha! It's a whole new world. So I accomplished what I set out to do. On my typical difficult climbing ride, I wanted to reduce the use of that. I wanted to shift some of the load down the cassette. And this Garbaruk, with the different spacing of the top three gears in this cassette, has allowed me to do that, and the numbers prove it, and my experience proved it. Now, upcoming video here, I think this week, went up with a bunch of gravel bike California guys, and we went out and they met in Big Bear, California, up in the mountains, and we did a pretty darn hard, felt hard to me at elevation, gravel bike ride. And while it wasn't terribly technical, we had a lot of fun single track climbing, and you'll see that in the video. And sometimes some of the grades are 15% plus in some of these climbs at elevation. And I just very much enjoyed the Garbaruk cassette. Closing those gaps at the top, you know, a long fire road grind where you're trying to get that cadence just right is one thing, but when you're shifting, you know, a couple hundred times over a single track ride, having that closer gap, man, that was really nice at the top of the cassette, because on the single tracks, I'm probably in the top 4 gears of my cassette for most of that ride. All right, anyway, the Garbaruk so far, it's been a total win for me. I did accomplish by the numbers, and by my ride experience, it's given me what I wanted. I don't feel like I lost anything performance-wise. It's a beautiful cassette. So far, so good. Long term, we'll see as far as anything crops up, you know, creaks or squeaks, or does it wear out? I don't think so. I think they seem like they make a very solid product. I am extremely pleased. Now, Real quick, what's coming up next? Well, the numbers show me that it's entirely likely I can change a little bit more. Could I go from a 40 tooth front ring to a 38 tooth front ring? How would that be on my gear usage on the road? Will I start to run out of top gear? Notice I didn't use the 10 tooth very much, and I didn't use the 12 very much. Maybe I'm underusing the bottom of my cassette as well as I was overusing the top. Before I forget, Garbaruk did not sponsor this video or send me this product for free, and they have no involvement in that other than they sold it to me just like you would. And so I don't have to make nice to Garbaruk and say good things about it. And no, I'm not going to buy you one. All right, what's next? Well, we're going to play with our chainring size, and then I got one more thing to do beyond that, and hopefully by then I'll have my 1x for gravel sorted for the way that I use it. All right, that's it for now for Granny Gear from the front porch. Sorry that was really long, but a lot of information there, and I'm pretty excited about it because you think, wow, you know, there are options out there sometimes. And it points out another thing before I close out. The little guy. God love the little guy. The little guy who comes in and gives you a high quality product that gives you an option to what the big guys are making. Now, you know, I don't hate SRAM or anything. I use SRAM on pretty much everything. But aren't options nice? And I really like the idea that they stepped in and gave us really improved ratios in a cassette that SRAM, for whatever reason, has not done outside of the T-type transmission. And I'm guessing it's likely to never do, but thank goodness we have Garbaruk. All right, that's it, guys. Have a great week and/or weekend. And as always, go ride your bikes and maybe think about your gearing and how you can make it better. All right, you guys take care.